Hey everyone, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show here on Reason and Theology. Really excited to have world-renowned expert on the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, who's actually offering a course on exploring the literature of the Hebrew Bible and ancient Israel. In fact, I have a link to it there in the show notes. Dr. Joel Baden, how are you? Welcome to the show.
Good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely honored. I saw that you're offering this course on the Old Testament. It's something that I'm very, very fascinated by. So I wanted to bring you on and talk a little bit about it. Maybe tell us a little bit about the overall overview of this course that you're offering.
Yeah, I mean, this is a sort of an academically minded, but for everybody out there, introduction to what this text is, or really what these texts are, right? What are we talking about when we talk about this, the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible? It's a library of 1,000 years worth of ancient literature, and trying to understand it in its historical context, understand what we might think about it and do with it today, and how it conveys meaning to us.
Yeah, and so that kind of maybe sparked your interest in doing the course. Did you maybe see a lacuna here where a lot of people have a gap in their knowledge on the Hebrew Bible?
I mean, I feel pretty confident that most people have a gap in their knowledge of the Hebrew Bible. It's just there's so much that you need to know in order to figure out what's going on in these texts, especially sort of historically. How many of us are familiar with the history and the language and the archaeology and all the bits and pieces that go into figuring out where this text came from? Lots of people obviously are familiar with lots of parts of the text from just broader culture or from church or from their personal backgrounds, but there's infinitely more to know. And all that stuff helps us to understand why the text looks the way it does. And I think that's a question that really rarely gets asked, actually.
And the lectures are currently ongoing right now?
Ongoing right now. You're in the middle of one. No, they are, but we are a few weeks into our semester. So it's we're churning our way through. We're still we're still in the first couple of books. But by the time we get through this thing in December, we will have covered most of. I can't cover the whole thing; it's too big, but big chunks of it.
So let's talk about the first 5 books, the Pentateuch or Torah. So a lot of people have historically believed that Moses was the author of these books, but it seems like recent scholarship in the last few hundred years has really begun to challenge that. Can you maybe give us a lay of the land here?
Yeah, that's a pretty wide definition of recent. Yeah, I mean, we're the idea of Moses being the author is ancient, right? It's 2,000 years old. The idea that Moses maybe wasn't the author, we're probably a good 400 years into people figuring that out from a variety of angles. But really, it's what we're dealing with in the last couple hundred years is the recognition that it's not that it wasn't Moses, it's that it wasn't any one person. That what we've got here is actually multiple authors embedded in a single text. And one of the joys of the scholarly approach here, at least the joy for me, this is mostly what I work on, is figuring out what these different stories are, and some of where they come from, and all the different ideas that they had. We're again even the first 5 books are a library, like the whole thing, and it's pretty neat to be able to recover the diversity of ancient writings and ancient authors and ideas that were floating around 2,000, 3,000 years ago.
What evidence would maybe compel scholars to believe that multiple people were authors of the Torah and not?
Sure. I mean, I could start in 1,000 places, but I'll start at the beginning. If you read Genesis 1, and you get a wonderful, clear notion of creation, and then you read Genesis 2, and you get another lovely, clear notion of creation, but not the same one. That is one of the ideas, that one of the places that scholars have been looking for, again, hundreds of years, to recognize that in fact what we've got here is not one weird story of creation, but in fact two perfectly nice stories of creation that just don't go together, right? They don't cohere into a single story. And in fact, you see that over and over again in the text, not just in the first couple of chapters, but like, famously, if you pick up the story of the flood, which like all of us know from culture and movies and like the stories and songs, and but you pick up the story of the flood and you quickly realize that it doesn't work, right? Like it doesn't hold together. It got all kinds of internal contradictions going on about how long the flood lasted and where the water came from and how many animals were on board and how many birds he sent and what happened afterwards. This kind of thing. It starts at the very beginning and it lasts all the way through. You've got just multiple internal contradictions and repetitions and other kinds of problems just with the story as a story. And when you like pay attention to those instead of trying to smooth them over, you end up recognizing that there's got to be multiple hands at work in this thing that have been sort of combined together into a text that we now have, but that actually isn't like super coherent.
And I want to ask a follow-up question here on kind of smoothing things over, and some people who have attempted to do that. But also, what internal evidence would maybe indicate that there were multiple authors concerning the theory that some authors were of a priestly class, others were? Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, what we can say about these different authors, we figure out once we've like got their texts separated for us. But like, I don't know, you pick up a book like Leviticus, which is all about like ritual law and sacrifice and priests and all that stuff. And like, you probably got something that was written by people who were like priests, right? Who cared about like that sort of sacrificial stuff. But you look elsewhere even in the first 5 books, and you get like similar stories being told, but like nobody, like without any like concern for that sort of stuff, or even knowledge of the kinds of ideas that you find in Leviticus. Leviticus has got like all these sacrifices that are introduced there. I'm not going to get into the weeds on this, but like all these sacrifices that are introduced in Leviticus is like, this is like how sacrifice should work, that literally nowhere else in the entire Bible anybody seems to have any knowledge of. And so like that gives us this idea that in fact, probably what we have here is a text that was written like by priests, probably for priests, that like had this particular view of how the ritual sacrifices ought to work, that has been combined with texts that didn't know or care about that sort of stuff the same way.
So talking a little bit about smoothing things over, we've seen many historical attempts to kind of do that with the Pentateuch. I'm thinking here of Augustine, and obviously you got more recently numerous evangelical scholars who have attempted to do that. And I've always been curious, so why do a lot of scholars, why do they remain unconvinced from those who would try to smooth things over? What kind of difficulties are they seeing with those kinds of attempts?
Well, when you're like, I'm trying to smooth a thing over, you're already admitting that there's something that needs to be smoothed over. So a lot of this comes down to just, general sort of attitude toward what this text is. In antiquity, the assumption for basically all readers was that like this was sacred text. This was God-given, God, dictated, divine origin, and as a result, like couldn't have problems. Right, like the definition of the thing was like, this must be a perfect text, right? It's the Bible, and that's a perfectly reasonable position from within its like intellectual and cultural framework. If you don't hold to that framework, if you are approaching this not from a like confessional standpoint, not from a religious standpoint, where you have like predispositions about the text being perfect, then you end up like asking different questions. Everyone's seeing the same evidence, right? Like we're all looking at the same text and seeing all these same sort of like what look like contradictions or issues. And if you are inclined to say, oh, well, like the text is perfect, therefore these must not be problems, then you smooth them out, right? Then you like make attempts to make it all sort of agree with itself. But without that predisposition, and this is like the definition of thinking about the text from like a critical, scholarly, academic perspective. And this is an approach that started really in the Enlightenment, in like the Renaissance and thereafter, in the 17th, 18th century, especially Europe, people were like, well, what if we didn't look at this in the way that has been sort of handed down through centuries of tradition, and we kind of looked at it like it was not scripture, but like just literature? Like, what if we just thought about this as a text, and like, what, would we assume the same things? Would we ask the same things? So it's really not an issue of like, it's not an issue so much of like the right way to read or the wrong way to read. It's more a question of like understanding that we are reading in certain ways, right? Like we are reading with certain assumptions. And if we like name those assumptions, then we're not like compelling everyone to assume that they should all read the same way.
Yeah. So it kind of boils down to your paradigm and your approach. Yeah, that's helpful. So let's talk a little bit about the book of Exodus specifically in relation in particular to archaeology. From what I understand, you're diving into this question. Is there archaeological evidence about the Exodus? Does it confirm or deny?
Sure. There's a lot of evidence, most of which is that we don't have any. Like if you count that as evidence, is evidence of absence of evidence. Like not always, but when the claim is like 2 million people like moved for 40 years through a space that's not very big, right? The Sinai Desert is really not that large. The fact that we have zero traces of any of that archaeologically, the fact that the story tells us that we've got like the entirety of like Pharaoh and his entire army dying, but the Egyptian record seems not to have any notion of such a thing. We've got like plagues that struck Egypt, and there's no Egyptian record. There's nothing in the Exodus story that can be correlated archaeologically. Does that mean it didn't happen? Yeah, I think it means it didn't happen, right? Like that's sort of, I think that's like the standard academic view of the thing, which isn't to say that there's not some core or kernel of the story that like might resonate with something historical, and there's lots of possibilities for that. I mean, we know that there were people enslaved in Egypt who are from the region that we think of as Israel. We know that slaves occasionally ran away. Like we have like letters and evidence like of people being like, hey, can you track down my runaway slaves? They are like going up toward Canaan, but it was like 2, not 2 million. So like it's one thing to say there's like it's completely made up out of total thin air, which is weird. Like nobody really is going to be like, if I were going to make up a story about the like glorious origins of my glorious people, I'd probably start us off as like enslaved in Egypt. That seems unlikely, but that's not the same thing as being like, well, and therefore the entire Exodus story as it's told to us in the Bible is true. In fact, like you need to go like detail by detail, and really like there's literally just nothing in the biblical account that has been archaeologically confirmed in the slightest.
One thing that I've often heard in response to that is that the Egyptians wouldn't report a defeat. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's a difference between like the Egyptians wouldn't report like a defeat, like a single defeat, but literally the Pharaoh and his entire army being wiped out, and all of the firstborn in like all of Egypt dying. Yeah, that's the kind of thing that would be pretty hard to miss. I think.
And I'm certainly no expert in the Hebrew language, but from what I understand, the word that represents thousands in the Old Testament that's used to describe how many people were involved in the Exodus could maybe be understood in a smaller way, not necessarily 1,000, maybe tens or something like that. And so some have argued maybe it was a much smaller Exodus. What are your thoughts on that?
Don't think it works. I don't think it works. I think like, words can have lots of different meanings, and indeed, like the word that generally means 1,000 can sometimes mean like a smaller group. But like at one point, at least, we get like a full enumeration of like here's all of the people like by tribe, right? Here's this many people from this tribe and this many people. Here's how many people left, and the answer comes out to like, I forget the exact number. It's like 603,200 something. Like you can't do that as like smaller bits. That it would be like, if I told you there were 603,250 people who left, but the thousands isn't a real number. Like that's like, it doesn't work, right? They're still doing math, right? And I think that it's pretty clear in the case of the number of people who left that they're really adding up individuals to get to thousands and hundreds of thousands.
So do you discuss in the course maybe what you would estimate to be biblical contradictions in the Hebrew Bible? Is that something that you go through?
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. I mean, and of course, like, they're all over the place. I mean, I just mentioned a couple, right? Like the creation accounts are a big one. Like, again, reading just the flood story is another, but there are like dozens and dozens of them. And I'm just talking about the first 5 books. There are contradictions in this story. There's contradictions in the laws. There's contradictions in characters and their names, and it's just like it's rampant in a sense. And it's funny, like, we as readers are like psychologically predisposed to not see them, right? When we pick up, this is true, like, of all readers in all texts, right? We pick up a text that we sort of walk into assuming it's telling us a continuous, like, coherent story, and that assumption sort of overrides our capacity to, like, notice weird things. And for many, many readers, that's exactly what's happening. And of course, for many, many people who know the Bible and its stories, they're not really reading the text anyway, right? One of the games that I like to play when I sort of teach this stuff is to ask anyone to tell you the story of the flood. And everybody tells it the same way, right? Everyone says, right, like, God tells Noah, take 2 of every animal, a male and female, right? It rains for 40 days and 40 nights. He sends out a dove. There's a rainbow. Like, this is the like universal, culturally accepted story. It's just not the text that's in the Bible. Like, that's not what the Bible says. The Bible says that God said to bring 2 of every animal. It also says God says to bring 14 of every animal. It says that there was rain for 40 days. It also says it's like cosmic waters from above and below, and it lasts 150 days. It does say he sent a dove. It also says he sent a raven. It does say there was a rainbow. It also says that when he got off the boat, Noah sacrificed a bunch of the animals, right? Like, there's parts of the story that we sort of like allied in our cultural tellings of them, and in the tellings that we get in Sunday school or in like movies or whatever. So, like, again, we've like 2,000 years worth of predisposition to not notice or not pay attention to, or to smooth over somehow the contradictions that are in the text. That doesn't mean they're not in there. It just means we're either like not looking for them or we're intentionally avoiding them, but they're all over the place.
You mentioned ravens there. That reminds me of ancient Near Eastern accounts of the flood that speak of ravens. So would you argue that perhaps some of the tensions here in the text could be due to grabbing from different accounts from ancient Near Eastern stories that may not necessarily be in harmony with each other, and that's maybe what's going on? Is that kind of the idea?
I mean, there is some of that. There certainly with the flood story, we've got multiple Israelite accounts of a story that for sure is of Mesopotamian origin, right? We've got all of these. We got multiple flood stories from Mesopotamia, which is actually useful to remember. Like, even in Mesopotamia, they didn't have one flood story that was like the true one. They had like a bunch of different versions of the flood story that were floating around and everyone was very happy with. Same thing is happening in Israel. Once you recognize that the Israelite like biblical versions are drawing on ancient texts, more ancient texts, right? Ancient Mesopotamian texts. Then, like, okay, so in one of those versions there's a raven, and in one of them there's a dove, and like in Mesopotamian accounts there's actually a raven and a dove and like another bird too, right? So there is some picking and choosing out of like the block of traditional flood storytelling. But that only gets us like so far. That only gets us like with the stories that are actually like have a connection with Mesopotamian stuff. Most of the Hebrew Bible and certainly most of the Pentateuch is not. It doesn't. You can't take it back there, right? What we're looking at is not like Israelite authors who are like, well, I like this part of that old text, I'm just going to grab it. But truly, like, these are like smart, creative, inventive authors who are retelling the stories that they know, right? Like, it's not just Mesopotamian tradition, right? Most of these stories go back to like pre-literary oral Israelite traditions. So like they're telling the story the way they know it or the way they'd like it to be, and somebody else is telling it the way that they know it or they'd like it to be, and it's not always the same. And that accounts for a lot of what's going on here.
I hope it's not too far off topic, but what I've heard some scholars argue is that perhaps what's going on with some of these tensions in the Old Testament is that the Israelites are grabbing from some polytheistic and even henotheistic elements in ancient Near Eastern cultures that's being adopted by the ancient Israelites. Later on, it's kind of smoothed over into a form of monotheism, but some traces still remain there in the biblical text. What are your thoughts on that? And is that something you explore?
It's definitely something we talk about. And the sort of adaptation of what you said that I would propose is it's not that Israelites were pulling from like older henotheistic, as you said, traditions. Just people don't know it. Henotheism is the notion that like there are many gods, but we only worship one of them. Mm-hmm. That's not like a non-Israelite idea that they're borrowing. That is the vast majority of the Hebrew Bible. The vast majority of the Old Testament takes exactly that perspective, which is, yeah, of course, there's like every nation has their gods. Like that's not what's like, that's a given. But the issue is like, we should all be worshiping our God, right? The God of Israel. And that is what so much of the text is obsessed with. It's like stop worshiping other gods. Like you have an obligation to worship this one, right? Specifically, the God who took us out of Egypt. It's like there's the transition to monotheism, like what we think of as sort of proper monotheism, like that, like there are no other gods. There's just this one. That doesn't happen until relatively late in what we would think of as relatively late in Israel's history, and relatively late in like the biblical texts. And you can see it happen in the text, right? You can see the transition from, hey, like, don't worship other gods, only worship this God, which is henotheism, to, like, those other gods are not, like, those other gods, those, like, idols, those, like, little trinkets that people worship are like, meaningless. That's not those aren't even a thing, right? You're worshiping the creation of human hands. Like, that idea comes up only for the first time in, like, the second half of the book of Isaiah. So like sometime in probably like the 6th century BCE, everything before that, the entirety of the Pentateuch and like all of the earlier prophets, they all understand that like, no, there's like lots of gods out there. It's not a question of whether they exist or not. It's a question of who you ought to be worshiping.
So can you talk a little bit about the role of redactors in compiling the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing to remember is once you start saying that like this, like either the Pentateuch has got multiple like texts in it, or even that the Bible as a whole has multiple texts in it, which like everybody understands, right? Like everybody recognizes that, I don't know, like Isaiah and Ezekiel aren't the same thing from the same time or the same voice. Like they have different ideas. Or like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes are like nothing but disagreeing with each other. So like we understand that like the library has been collected, and the same thing is true within individual texts like the Pentateuch, where you've got or the like the histories of Joshua and Judges and Samuel and Kings, right? What you've got here is like a bunch of texts that have been collected together, edited, shaped. In various ways, like, and not always in the same way. So that, for example, in the Pentateuch, what we have is really like 4 originally independent texts that have just been like combined into a single running story. It's like if somebody took the 4 Gospels and was like, instead of having 4 Gospels, let's just have one. And it was like, whatever, somebody did that in like the 2nd century. Yep. So like that's one impulse. And then like in the books of Joshua through Kings, you have a different impulse, which is like, I'm going to take from a bunch of stuff, but I'm going to like edit it all so that it has a consistent viewpoint, even when the stuff that I'm editing together doesn't have a consistent viewpoint, doesn't like, and like you can see those tensions. Redactors or editors are responsible really for the text we have. There's almost not a single text of the Hebrew Bible that has not undergone some process of editing over time. I think this is probably true of the New Testament as well. But like all of these texts, it's not like they were written and just left to be for the next 2,000 years. They were written and they were preserved and transmitted in communities who were reading them and copying them and adapting them, and in many cases updating them.
Well, I'm curious. Is there external evidence for this process of redaction, or is it all just internal evidence? Given that we don't have the original autographs.
Yeah, I mean, not only we don't have the original autographs, we don't have like anywher near them. We're like we're like 1,000 years before we get anything. We're so far away from original autographs. I mean, there's a lot of internal evidence, but like I understand people really want like the external proof, because like otherwise it's the theory. It is just a theory. Like we should understand that, like, what we're talking about is like theories and hypotheses. They're not like based on nothing. They are based on like evidence in the text. There are certain things that like I like to point to. For example, among my favorites is like there are 2 Psalms that like retell like Israel's history, like what we're talking about in the stories of the Pentateuch.
Yeah, and
one of them tells the story just like you find it in the text we have, right? Like it's like all the bits and pieces that you expect. And one of them, so that's Psalm 105, the one that tells everything. And Psalm 78 actually only tells the story as it was told by one of the like source texts of the Pentateuch. Mm-hmm. So like in like the abstract, if you didn't have the scholarly theory about where the text comes from, you'd be like, why choose these like little bits to tell? But once you recognize that in fact those bits are all from one of the source texts, then it's like, oh, that's actually pretty good evidence that whoever wrote that psalm was familiar not with the whole thing, but just with that one text. And that's like, it's like still internal to the Bible, but it's pretty good. I should say, like I mentioned it a second ago, but like the fact that like somebody took the Gospels and was like, what if we turn these into one running story as opposed to 4 distinct ones? Like that's kind of exactly what I'm talking about. So like it's not like this was an unknown concept in antiquity, of like recognizing that I've got different versions of this thing that don't always agree, but like I'm going to try and like make it all into one story, even if that one story then doesn't really work perfectly. Like it's a thing that happened, and we have evidence also from antiquity of like texts that grew over time, right? Famously, the ancient like Mesopotamian very famous Epic of Gilgamesh, which like lots of people have heard of, if not read. Like Gilgamesh, we have like material evidence of its growth, right? We have early versions and we have later versions with more stuff in them. But so like illustrates that like over time people were adding as they were recopying and transmitting this stuff. And we've got great evidence for this also, not to jump too far out of my comfort zone, but like the New Testament has this like actually much more abundantly, because we have at least much closer to earlier, like not autographs, but we have like much earlier texts of the New Testament relative to its composition than we do the Old Testament. So the New Testament, we have manuscripts that have that like are missing things, like from like earlier manuscripts, and then later manuscripts that have stuff that we're like, if you didn't know, you'd be like, oh, that's just Bible. Just to give, like, I'm sure you're aware, but like the most famous example is, right, like in the Gospel of John, right, the story about the woman caught in adultery with the like, he who was without sin cast the first stone, like that great line, that whole story, but that doesn't show up in texts, in manuscripts of the Gospel of John until like the 4th century. We have manuscripts from well before that just don't have that story in it. So like we need to get out of the mindset of like, well, the Bible was written and it was done and like no one ever touched it, and it was perfect and pure. Right? Like we know from like all the evidence we have that in fact these texts were constantly being updated and like rewritten and added to and reshaped, and like that's a totally normal part of like what it means to be a biblical text.
So it seems like we see that with the book of Jeremiah and the manuscript witnesses.
Yeah, I mean, so Jeremiah, there's a few of them. Jeremiah, like Esther, Samuel, these are all texts that like the traditional Hebrew text that underlies most of the Bibles that we have is distinct from the ancient Greek translation from like the 3rd century. Mm-hmm. And certainly in the case of Jeremiah, and especially the book of Samuel, what's wonderful is like the Dead Sea Scrolls have copies of both versions, right? Like of both the Hebrew version that we know and like a Hebrew text of the Greek version of the Greek translation, suggesting that like there were just two editions of the text floating around simultaneously. It's not even a question of like, well, one was the original and one was like a later expansion. It's more that like they just had multiple versions of the thing. The text isn't stable the way that I think most people think of the Bible as being. This is like the great insight that the Dead Sea Scrolls gave us, was like, it turns out that it's not like original text and then like a bunch of like deviations from it that are like we could think of as erroneous. Actually, like just multiple editions of the text that are all authoritative and good. They're just like out there at the same time.
I remember Emmanuel Tove talking a lot about that. So wrapping it up, I know we're up against the clock here. One final question, just about the canon. How exactly what was the canon for the Hebrew Bible established? Because it seems like even by the time of the first century, there's multiple canons floating around there. So maybe talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls are good for this too, right? Like we think of the Bible as being like this particular set of books. Mm-hmm. The Dead Sea Scrolls, you can't tell, right? Like, did their canon did they have such a thing as a canon? Right. I think probably not. Like, they had a library. They had books that they considered important enough to preserve in those pots that like we then found. And they include a lot of the texts that we consider biblical, in fact, probably all of them. But they also include other stuff like that is undifferentiated in terms of its status. The canon of the Hebrew Bible was not established by like some top-down, like nobody got together and was like, let's vote on this. Really, what we consider the canon of the Hebrew Bible is a canon that emerged through a community's like use of various texts, right? Like, and for us, for the Hebrew Bible, the community that determined that was like the ancient rabbis, right? Of like early Judaism in the first few centuries of the Common Era. It's the books that they considered to be scriptural that became scriptural. And if the Dead Sea Scroll community had been the one that survived, and the early rabbinic community had been like wiped out by the Romans, our canon would be different. The canon as a whole is always a readerly phenomenon, right? It's always shaped by the community that's using it, which is why Jews have one canon, and Catholics have one canon, and Protestants have a different canon, and like the Greek Orthodox Church has a different canon, and like, go on, the Ethiopian, like all of these like communities have different canons because which texts we consider to be scriptural or even biblical is determined not by like what I like to say is this: a book isn't biblical by virtue of having been like written. Nobody wrote Bible, right? Nobody sat down and was like, I'm going to write Bible today, right? They were just writing stuff. They were writing literature, and readers determined this is what we care about. This is what counts. This is what's in. This is what's out. This is what I consider to be in. Another community across the river might consider something else to be in. It's a negotiation that's done on the reader side, not on the text side.
And it's usually by an appeal to authority that one determines one particular set of books, right? And that will vary depending on what authority one appeals to.
Sure. I mean, I will say, like, for the rabbis of ancient Judaism, they weren't like, oh, God told us these books were the right ones. They were just like, these are our books. And like, these are not our books. And there are books that like, there are lots of books from ancient Judaism that the rabbis were like, nah, not that one. But that like early Christians who were like real close to being like early Jews were like, no, like we like that one. So, books that are in the canon for Christianity, even if they're in as like in the category of like Apocrypha or like Deuterocanonical, books like Maccabees and Tobit and Judith and Ben Sira and like there's all these books that like are ancient Jewish books written first in Hebrew for the same community that was like reading all the other biblical books. That like the early Jewish community was like, nah, like they might be fine, but like no, they didn't. We just don't categorize them that way. And Christians were like, I think we could categorize them that way. That sounds fine. So you're right. It's like there's some authority involved, but it's really like I really want to put it on like communities of readership.
Okay.
Is what makes a canon a canon.
I see what you're saying. Very, very helpful. I have so many other questions, but I know we're out of time, and I know you tackle many other questions in your series here. I want to direct everybody to it. There's a link to it there in the show notes. And of course, also put in a plug for anything else you want to make the viewers aware of.
No, like there's like, how self-aggrandizing am I supposed to be, right? Like there's lots of cool stuff online, right? There's the class I'm teaching that we're talking about right now. There are like lots of interviews and videos and like, I don't know. I've got like a cool new book out. I'll just plug that. Why not? I've got a cool new book out that's like written for like, a wider audience that is a book of like a bunch of biblical words that, when you read them in translation in English after 2,000 years of mostly like Christian interpretation, like they sound like really weighty theological terms like grace or like purity or holiness or sin, or like terms like love. Like these are words that have like acquired all of this like theological baggage. And the book is sort of being like, well, but like 2,500 years ago, what did they mean? What did they communicate? And not like, how do we replace one with the other, but like, how do we think about these terms in like bringing all of their parts together? I think it's called Lost in Translation, and it's relatively inexpensive, which is a nice thing to be able to say about a book from an academic.
Awesome. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Dr. Joel Baden, thank you so much for coming on. It was an honor.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We'll see y'all later.